Today we're going to be reviewing the Honda Accord Hybrid. Not like other reviewers that would blast hybrids for their sluggish driving performance, yet praise them for their fuel economy, we're going to be taking a look under the hood and underneath this Accord to see what's inside and how it works, and what Honda has done to transform their regular Accord with very primitive technology into a hybrid. And we're going to start under the hood where we have Honda's J30 V6 engine. Now this is very similar to the engine used in the regular Honda Accord, although the engine heads are different because it uses their VTEC system for cylinder deactivation. Now sandwiching between the engine and the transmission on the driver's side is a thin electric motor, and you can see that high voltage orange cable that will run to power it. And then underneath the driver's side airbox we have a slimmed down version of the automatic transmission, and that's because this entire thing is packaged in the same packaging as the regular Accord. And that's probably the reason why the Accord Hybrid didn't succeed as well, is because they chose their V6 engine paired with an electric motor to boost power. So this is more of a power hybrid. It doesn't run on the electric motor exclusively, as opposed to using a fuel sipping 4-cylinder with a CVT like the Camry or Altima hybrids of the mid-2000s. Now taking a look at some of the components under the hood here, the engine is situated transversely for front wheel drive. We've got a washer reservoir here and the ABS motor. Over in the corner there we have the master cylinder, fuse box, air box, and the battery, as well as the coolant reservoir at the front. Now we're going to start by taking a look at the air intake system of the Accord. Hot air from the engine bay is drawn down into this tube here. It'll go down into a reservoir underneath the battery and then back up through this air box to get filtered out, then past the mass airflow sensor, and then into a drive-by-wire throttle body, and into a rather large air intake plenum bowl here, where it'll then get distributed to each head at the front and the back. Now surprisingly, for an older car, accessing the air filter on these is a little cumbersome. You do have to use tools to loosen off these 8mm bolts and then disconnect the mass airflow sensor, and then once that's done we have to lift off the air box. And because of this accordion here, things are going to get pretty difficult to remove. Yeah, this thing is super cumbersome. Then you've also got a hard line that ties into here. Now these accordions are known to break. You can see this one actually looks like it's been replaced before. Pull it off from the throttle body. Maybe that'll give me enough room to finally take out that air box, and then I can access the air filter. Now once the air box is removed, you have clear access to this drive-by-wire throttle body. Now once the air makes it into this air intake plenum, it does have this motor here that's going to control a flap on the inside here, and that's either going to adjust for higher airflow or better mixing at lower RPMs. Now taking a look across the top of the engine here, we do have metal valve covers on the front and the rear. We've got this oil dipstick here, and this does take 5W20 weight oil. Now taking a look underneath the Accord Hybrid, things are generally pretty flat. There's no real attempts at smoothing things out for aerodynamics. As a result, everything's exposed, and because it's exposed, it's going to start to rust. As you can see here, a lot of older Hondas had problems with rusting. This one is no exception. It's definitely a victim of too many Canadian winters. And over on the passenger side here, we've got this oil pan and the oil drain plug. Surprisingly, this oil pan is actually made of aluminum. Now like on most V6 Hondas, the oil filter is located inside of this little cavity here for the control arm on the passenger side, just beside the wheel here. It's kind of open and exposed to a lot of debris hitting it, which I don't like, but it is a spin-on style filter, which is going to make for pretty quick and easy oil changes. Now changing spark plugs on this is pretty straightforward. You have 3 ignition coils over here to access the 3 front ones. Now accessing the 3 spark plugs at the back are pretty straightforward. Unlike Nissan or Toyota, where you have a big intake that scoops over the rear that you have to remove, this one the intake is nice and flat. And so that means you can easily access the rear spark plugs once you remove this high voltage wire. Now on the passenger side of the engine, underneath this cover here, we do have a timing belt, which means that you will have to service it every 90 or 100,000 miles to replace it. Honda still uses timing belts in their V6s up to today. Anyways, the water pump is also buried down, powered off of the timing belt inside of there. So when you do service this timing belt, you should probably change that water pump out as preventative maintenance. Now working inside of here is pretty tight. You've got a lot of components right up against you here to work against, especially down at the back here where the rear camshaft is. You will have to remove this engine mount and some of the clutter around here just to try and work, but it's a pretty tight job. Now if you're familiar with other V6 Hondas, you'll notice that there's a couple of accessories that are missing from the front half of this engine. Usually in this cavity over here, you'd have your power steering pump, and somewhere up here you'd have the alternator, but those two are missing on this hybrid model. That's because it uses electric power steering, and there's no alternator because you have an electric motor that'll do the job of recharging that 12-volt battery. However, if you do look further down, there is a serpentine belt connects to the crankshaft to this AC compressor. Now this AC compressor is a unique one because it's powered off of the belt when the engine is running, but when your IMA system kicks in and you're at idle stop, your engine is no longer running, but you still need AC in the car, so it's going to supplement it with an electric motor that's going to turn that AC compressor so you can continue to get AC in your car when you're stuck in traffic. And that's why you've also got this high voltage wire that goes down to the AC compressor and is powered by the battery pack. Now this on the Honda Odyssey was one of the very first implementations of variable cylinder management, which means that you could run on these 3 front cylinders and completely shut off the rear 3 cylinders so that you could save fuel, especially if you're just cruising on the highway or slowing down to a stop. Now while a V6 engine is somewhat balanced while driving along, driving around on 3 cylinders alone is going to cause a lot of vibration and noise. Now to counteract those vibrations, Honda's using electric active engine mounts. So you'll notice that there's one engine mount down at the bottom here, and there is actually a plug off to the side which you can turn on and off to change its damping frequency according to what mode the engine is in. Now in addition to the front mount, there's also a mount down at the rear inside of here that connects to the subframe. Then you've got a mount on the side here that connects to the body, as well as underneath the airbox and battery that connect the transmission to the body. And here's a look at one of the active engine mounts from underneath. This one mounts at the subframe. You can see the plug located for it over here. And the other engine mount is located at the back of the subframe over here. Over here on the driver's side, you can see the transmission mount to the subframe. Now, variable cylinder management was the cause of a lot of engine failures on newer Honda Accords that have VCM technology. So later we're going to be tearing this engine down so we can see how that works and what's causing those problems. Now when you pair off variable cylinder management with Honda's regular VTEC system, which I've got another video on how that works linked below, Honda calls it their intelligent VTEC system. Now in addition to active engine mounts, Honda also included active noise cancellation, especially when VCM is enabled, and that used the stereo head unit to pump sound through the stereo speakers in order to cancel out certain frequencies and noises that you don't like to hear. Now sometimes those noise cancellation modules did fail, and then you'd be pumping out random noises from your dashboard, and that's pretty annoying. Now the PCV valve is located right next to the oil dipstick on the front of the engine. Now since these engines don't have variable valve timing, Honda's still using an EGR system as a pollution control device. It's basically going to take exhaust gases from the front half of the head here and bring them back around to the intake side, so it kind of goes through the engine once more again. Now this is a weak spot on some Hondas. When they do get clogged up, you can get a lot of surging. Now the fuel system on the Accord's engine is still port injected, even though this is the hybrid model. You got the fuel line that's going to come in here and split off to 2 fuel rails that are going to feed each bank of cylinders. And if you look closely, you can see one of the fuel injectors here where it's going to inject fuel into this lower intake plenum before going down into the engine head. And now we'll have a listen to the startup sound. Now taking a look at the hybrid drive system here, we've got a 3-phase synchronous permanent magnet electric motor sandwiched in between here. You can see the 3 different wires here coming in for the 3 phases. It'll then go through this shielded wire all the way out to behind the seat where the battery and inverter is located. Now this is a mild hybrid, which means that you can't exclusively drive off of electric power alone the way you could in modern hybrid vehicles. It was mostly made to help with the idle start stop system, as well as increase the power output from this engine while still maintaining about the same fuel economy as the regular V6 Accord. Now, all throughout the vehicle, from the back to the front, we have this orange cable that basically highlights that this is a very high voltage cable, and you could get shocked if you try to trouble it or it gets damaged. Now with the rear seats removed, this is where the rest of the hybrid system lives. Over on this half here is where all the computers are, the ECU that governs the hybrid system, as well as the power inverters and voltage regulators. Over on this half here is the battery. It's rather small because it only takes up this half, but then again, this is not a battery electric vehicle. This is just used for power boost. Now unlike newer battery systems which are water cooled, this one is just air cooled. It's got a fan inside of here with a ducting system that'll blow the air through these vents. I found some non-OEM duct tape here, so I'm pretty sure someone's been here before. Not like a German car, which would use weird security bits and triple square heads, Honda is actually using regular Torx as their security fastener for this battery pack. I like how Honda threats you that you will be killed or hurt. And with that cover removed, you can see all of the electronics in and behind here. At the top here, we've got our motor driver, which is responsible for taking all that power and controlling it into the 3-phase power that the motor needs. You can see that's the line that'll run down underneath the car with its 3 phases. Over here, we've got the line that'll come in for our 12 volts to charge our 12-volt battery at the front, because this car doesn't have an alternator. Of course, you've got your control unit here to control the hybrid system, and your connections here for your high voltage battery. Now the battery itself consists of 120 cells. They look like D batteries. Each are 1.2 volts, and they are the nickel metal hydride type. Now here's your main power switch that'll turn the entire hybrid system off, because we're going to be taking apart this entire thing to see what's inside and how it works in a future video. Now looking at the trunk of the Accord Hybrid, you'll see that some of the space is taken up in terms of the length, and you can no longer fold the seats, but overall you still do have a generous amount of trunk space, considering where the battery pack is. Next up, we'll take a look at the Accord's transmission. Now there is an electric motor that's about 68 millimeters wide that has to be sandwiched between the flywheel and the torque converter on this hybrid model. As a result, they've had to slim down the transmission quite a bit and kind of push it underneath the battery and the airbox, and they had to get rid of the automatic transmission fluid pump from inside. As a result, they use an electric fluid pump to circulate fluid in the transmission. Now the dipstick is easily accessible from the top here, which is going to be good, so you can check your transmission fluid and change it out accordingly. Now if you're old enough to remember, a lot of V6 automatic Hondas used to suffer from automatic transmission failure due to a defect in the design causing the second gear to overheat. Luckily though, this one's from 2005, where Honda started to address those issues and getting less and less failures. But if you had anything older than this, you were pretty much down for a transmission replacement at some point in the car's lifetime. Now this car will use the electric motor sandwiched between here as a starter motor when you're in idle stop mode to restart the engine. However, if that system does fail, they do have a backup starter motor, which is a traditional style, mounted right at the front of the transmission here. Now looking over here towards the driver's side, you can see just where the engine ends, we've got this little piece here, which is the electric motor. That's right, the electric motor is only this thick here, 68 millimeters, and then that'll bolt up to this slimmer down transmission on this side. Now this is a 5-speed automatic transmission, similar to what you would find in a regular Honda Accord. Over here we have the drain plug for the mandatory fluid changes, especially if you don't want these transmissions to burn out. Now this transmission has a cooler that's built into the radiator itself. You've got one line that brings in ATF over here, and then it comes back out through this line over here. Of course, newer vehicles do the opposite and circulate coolant through the transmission itself where there's a heat exchanger. Now once the automatic's done changing its gear ratios inside of here, so I'm going to send power out to this rear differential, which will then go out to the 2 axles on either side. One thing with these Honda axles is that they actually bolt into this shaft over here, because there's a carrier bearing, and then that shaft is then going to go to the transmission, so it's actually not all one piece. Now what I've seen in a lot of Hondas is that these axles tend to snap right at the location of this counterweight over here. You see what happens is a lot of water and crud is going to build up and start corrosion underneath this piece itself, and then when VTEC kicks in and gives you all that torque that you don't really have, it's just going to cause this axle to snap. Now taking a look at the Accord Hybrid steering setup, this is an electric power steering, which is one of Honda Accord's first implementations of electric steering. We've got this shaft that's going to come out of the firewall here to the rack, which sits down over here. Now the assist motor sits over here on the rack itself, just above the subframe. It's a little difficult to see. Now looking in from the right side tie rod, you can see the connector that goes to the electric power steering motor, which is mounted to the steering rack. Next, we'll take a look at the Accord Hybrid's braking system. Now, because this is a mild hybrid and the engine is always on, we just have a traditional master brake cylinder here with a brake booster mounted on the firewall, powered off of this vacuum line from the intake manifold. Now, of course, if you had a traditional hybrid, you'd probably want to power that with a vacuum pump because the engine isn't always running with the car. Now, the brake lines are going to come from the master cylinder across the firewall over here to the ABS actuator and then out to the wheels. This will be responsible for anti-lock brakes and traction control. Of course, this was long before stability control was mandated, much less any autonomous braking features. Now taking a look at the front brakes in the Accord, things are very traditional here with just a single piston floating caliper with a disc rotor. Doing a brake job on this is pretty straightforward, with the only exception being these stupid rotor screws that Honda tends to use. They always tend to strip out, leaving the rotor stuck on there, and then you got to drill them out. Now taking a look at the rear brakes on the Honda Accord, you've got a typical floating caliper with a disc rotor. Now you'd think that the parking brake assembly is actually buried in here, but instead it's on the caliper. Here you can see see where the parking brake cable is going to clamp down on the spring-loaded mechanism to squeeze the disc rotors. There's no electric motors here like in newer vehicles. Next, we'll take a look at the exhaust system on the Accord Hybrid. It's basically the same thing as the regular V6 Accords. You've got a two-way catalytic converter at the front here for these banks. The exhaust manifold is integrated into the head. And there's another one at the back here, which is a little difficult to see. Here's a look at the front catalytic converter from underneath. You see the exhaust is then going to come down to this Y pipe over here and join from the exhaust coming from the other catalytic converter for the rear bank up over here, and then flow through this flex pipe into another catalytic converter out the back. Now that exhaust is then going to travel through one silencer, then a second silencer, and then out to the back to the muffler. And that exhaust is then going to come to the back here where it's going to split off into a dual muffler setup straight out the back of the car. There's no fake exhaust tips, even though this is a hybrid. I'm actually quite intrigued how the front half of this exhaust system hasn't rotted out yet. It looks like it's either been replaced or just really lasted a long time. And now we'll have a listen to the exhaust. Now taking a look at the front suspension on the Honda Accord, just like the regular Honda Accord, TSX and TL of this era, this uses a double wishbone front suspension, which is actually pretty advanced, especially for a family sedan from back in the day. Even nowadays, family sedans are going with the much cheaper McPherson strut design option. Now the top here, we've got this upper control arm that has this ball joint that ties to this long and slender steel steering knuckle over here. You've got the strut located here, mounted to the body at the top, and it's mounted down to this fork at the bottom here, which ties into the lower control arm. This fork is here to go around the axle because this is a front wheel drive. Just like all old Hondas, this one's going to need ball joints soon. Now what I find interesting is the front lower control arm. Now at the back here we've got the small bushing, which is responsible for turning or handling, and at the front here we have the large bushing, which is responsible for comfort. Usually they're flipped backwards so that the comfort bushing is at the back and the handling bushing is at the front, but instead Honda's chosen to go a little backward with this design. And looking from the back side here, we've got our inner and our outer tie rods, as well as the stabilizer link and the sway bar. Now I've got an entire video on how to rebuild this suspension, including the lower control arm, sway bar links, inner and outer tie rods, and the upper control arm, as well as ball joints. So make sure you check those videos out in the description below. Now at the bottom here, we've got the lower ball joint, which is pressed into the knuckle itself. And then we've got the lower control arm that just ties in with the taper over here. Now because this is a double wishbone design, there's a shock that is mounted over here, which means that all the weight of the vehicle has to be transferred through this ball joint, which is going to increase its wear. Eventually these are going to have to be replaced. Now if you've seen my lower ball joint replacement video, it's not an easy task to get to this ball joint because you pretty much have to remove the knuckle, get the brakes off, get this lower control arm off, and remove the axle in order to be able to press this out. This is definitely going to be a high maintenance item because it's going to wear out pretty fast, and you should definitely get it taken care of because it's a loaded ball joint, and if it fails, it could cause catastrophic failure because it takes the whole weight of the vehicle. Now unfortunately, the wheel bearing inside of here is also a pressed-in design, so you can't just unbolt it and remove it. You will have to take the whole thing apart and take it to a shop press to get it pressed out. Now overall, I think having a double wishbone front suspension on a family sedan is actually pretty cool because that's what gave this vehicle a competitive edge in handling for its time, especially if you compare it to say a Camry or an Altima that had a McPherson design. The only downside is you've got a lot of extra moving parts here that are load bearing, which is going to mean that you're going to have to pay a lot more on maintenance to replace these components, and a typical family sedan owner might tend to neglect this. I think cost and maintenance was ultimately what caused the Accord to lose this double wishbone design and competitive handling edge when it went to the 9th generation redesign. Okay, so I'm trying to jack up the rear and the entire rear rocker panel is so crunchy and rusty. Now the back of the Honda Accord suspension, you'll find a 5-link suspension, which is actually quite unique for a family sedan. We got our front upper control arms and rear upper control arms here. We've got the rear lateral link over here. There's another lateral link buried underneath here at the bottom, and then we've got our trailing arm over here. Now just like the front, having a 5-link design is going to be good for handling, and that's why these cars handle so well. It's just too bad that you don't really see too many family sedans with a 5-link suspension at the back here, as complicated as this. Of course, the downside to this is each one of these links here has a wear point at the end of it, whether it's a spherical bushing, a rubber bushing, or an upper ball joint like this, and those have to be replaced at some point. Now unlike the front, we do have a aluminum knuckle with a bolted on rear bearing here, so it's pretty easy to swap out the whole hub assembly. Now the shock itself bolts up with just one bolt up at the top there, and then another bolt down at the bottom over here. I've got a video on how to replace that, so make sure you check it out. And here's a look at that rear suspension from underneath here. You can see they've all got different tie points on the subframe over here and up at the top there. And these ones do have adjustable bolts for camber. However, a common problem with anything that ages is that these bolts are going to get stuck and seize in the bushings when you have to replace these arms. And good luck trying to get that out. Now, one thing that differs from the regular Accord is that the rear knuckles are made of aluminum instead of steel, which is going to lighten things up a little bit back here. Just kind of stands out that this is new tech versus everything else that's rusting out. Now at the back here, this piece of rust is the sway bar, this tiny little dinky thing. One of the common things is to upgrade this to the one from the Acura TL. Just a couple of bolts here at the bushing on either side, and the end link where it joins up over here to that shock mount. Next, we'll take a look at the Accord's cooling system. Now things are fairly straightforward. It's got a simple radiator up at the front here with your radiator fans. Surprisingly, the radiator fan shrouds are made of metal still. We've got our coolant reservoir over here, as well as our upper and lower radiator hoses. Now if you follow those two hoses, we've got our coolant temperature sensor over here, as well as a thermostat located over here, which is fairly easy to access just below the throttle body. I guess the most difficult part of the cooling system to access is the water pump, which is located inside of the front half of the engine, driven off of the timing belt. And here's a look at the cooling system from underneath. We do have a petcock valve here to drain the radiator, unlike newer cars where you actually have to remove the radiator hose to drain it. Now the back here, underneath all this rust of what is the rear subframe, is where the fuel tank is located. Luckily it's made of plastic, so it's not going to rust as fast as everything around it down here. Now the evap canister is located just in front of that gas tank underneath this plastic shield here. Now while many cars you access the fuel pump from underneath the back seat, since the tank is pushed back quite a bit in the Accord, you access it from inside the trunk through this panel over here. Now overall, without a doubt, the 7th generation Honda Accord was pretty well engineered overall. They did last quite a long time. You can see this one got over 400,000 kilometers, and it starts up and runs really smooth. Ooh, that sounds sick. However, I think Honda really lost out on its implementation of this primitive hybrid technology. Just using an electric motor in between the engine and transmission with a battery pack just to boost the power of an already powerful engine doesn't really make sense in terms of the extra $4,000 you have to spend on this compared to the regular V6 Accord. Especially if you consider you didn't really get much of a fuel savings over the regular V6 and that it can't really run on its electric battery alone. The point of buying a hybrid is really to save fuel, and that's just going to be eaten up in the cost of replacing the battery, especially if you want to own this thing long term. So I give kudos to Honda for making a really good family sedan for what it is, that handles well due to a nice suspension design, a really sturdy V6 engine, and hopefully the transmission. Now I'm going to be completely taking apart this car so we can take a closer look at all the components in the powertrain and the hybrid system to see how it works. Make sure you follow me on Instagram for more behind the scenes footage and subscribe for more videos just like this one.